Reminds me of the little girl in the southern Sudan who was starving to death, and 20 feet away stood a vulture. Kevin Carter won a Pulitzer Prize for this picture. 3 months after he took it, sadly, he took his own life. There seemed to be something out of balance about a vulture standing up and a little girl sitting down. A global disequilibrium, if you will, a global sloping of the floor that's more than just the earth tilting on its axis. There is a gravitational pull to suffering that pulls us down. And so I'll make this observation about what I see in Revelation 6 and what I see in the trenches of pastoral care. And it may seem nearsighted to some, but it won't to those who suffer. Here it is. When we suffer alone, we want to sit down. And for lack of better terminology, excuse me here, we want to shut up. There is a weightiness, there is a heaviness to suffering, there's a punch to pain that knocks the wind out of us as people. And I think it would be very myopic of us if we read Revelation 6 solely through the lens of our experience as Americans, when there is a global undercurrent to the text in Revelation chapter 6. In the mid-1990s, 20 years ago, I was living in the country of Haiti. And I had just done some shopping in the open-air market. I step out onto this busy street. I have a sack of rice in one hand and a sack of fruit in the other. And that's when I see him. Seated directly across the street from me, he's barely clothed. His legs are tragic, twisted, misshapen mess. He's covered from head to toe in sweat and dust, and flies make their home on him. But it's his eyes that I'll never forget. His eyes danced around here and there, never really fixed on anything. He was blind. And in his hands, he was holding a little bowl, and he was begging from people. I watched as several people walked by him, passed him by, ignored his cries for help. Then he set his bowl down and very methodically pulled a board from his bag, and he set it down in the open sewage that runs along the roadways in most third world countries, and he blocked its flow. And then he put his hands in it. And he began to sift and search as if he was looking for something of great value. And I don't know if you've ever had these kind of experiences where you feel like everything around you is going on in slow motion. But it was as if God had torn a page from a National Geographic magazine and was just holding it up in front of me for me to see. And I watched as he pulled out a few pennies, and a few old AA batteries. He cleaned them off. And he tucked them under his leg as if they were treasures to be protected. And I gave him my food, the money that I had on me. My emotions got the better of me because I was a long way from Columbia, Missouri, where I was raised, and I was a long way from heaven where I will spend eternity. I was caught in some warped dimension in between, wrought with human frailty. And he could tell that I was crying. And so he grabs me by the face and he pulls me in close, forehead to forehead, and very simply but very clearly, he said, "Thank you. Thank you." I couldn't talk, but he could. What do you say in response to suffering like that? Other than how long? And who can stand? That's the way I feel about this bracelet. Keep it in my desk at work. It looks like any bracelet you'd get at a concert or an amusement park, but it's far from amusing. This is what the World Health Organization uses to gauge starvation on the continent of Africa. They put it on the wrist of little children. And as the doctors make their rounds, anything in the green sector means well-fed. Anything in the pink sector means needs attention. And anything in the red sector means hopeless near death. As a dad to a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, I don't know what to say to this, other than how long and who can stand. Reminds me of a picture I keep in my office. friend of mine is a humanitarian photographer. And he snapped this picture on the streets of Madrid. This young man's missing his arms. All he has to his name is the shirt on his back and a few coins in his cup. And my buddy said the day he took it, it was like no one would look him in the eyes. It was as if he was invisible. Translation, he's suffering alone. Right next to it, I keep this picture. Same photographer, same friend took it, this time in the city of Rome. 70-year-old woman begging outside of a basilica. And there are 17 people in the frame, but if you notice, they've just left a worship service. They've been singing about Jesus, but no one's looking at her. No one's paying attention to her. No one's caring for her. Translation, she's suffering alone. I don't know what to say to that, other than how long and who can stand. When I was a little boy, my parents started taking in Vietnamese refugees after the war, and honestly, I don't remember a time when other people weren't living with us. There was this one family that had a little girl named Hao, who had been so traumatized by the sights and sounds of war that when we would play in the backyard as kids, anytime a commercial airliner would fly over, she would run to a tree and hide. And she would slide down the trunk and she'd put her fingers in her ears and she would just stare off into space with this catatonic look. And as a kid, I started to realize, man, when we suffer alone, when people suffer alone, they don't want to stand, they don't want to speak. In response to a rash of suicides in our city in Lexington, and in response to my mother-in-law living with us for 3 years and just dying of cancer, I made this sign 10 years ago. And I started standing on a street corner in downtown Lexington, and I do it on Tuesdays. And some people think I've lost a bet. Other people think they're on some kind of hidden camera show. One of my first weeks out there, probably 9 years ago, there was this guy who came up and he had this really great look, and then the closer he got really upset and he said, "Oh, I thought it said free hogs." I mean, only in Kentucky would people, they were giving away free farm animals, right, on the street corner? There was a courthouse across the street from where I do it, and this judge would send people that he was sentencing for dealing drugs. As part of their sentence, they had to come and hug me, right? So I got a lot of side hugs that day. It was amazing. But people have cussed at me, thrown things on me. One guy took my sign one day, and he was so angry. And he threatened to tear it up if I didn't leave. I didn't retaliate. I just put my hands in my pockets. I smiled and I said, "Man, if you tear up my sign, you just prove why I need to be down here." One of the most impacting conversations over the years happened with this woman who rode up on her bicycle. I didn't know it, but there was a newspaper reporter across the street taking a picture of it, and she was taking hits on her cigarette. She's had this curious look on her face. What are you doing? And then she finally said it. She said, "I can't read. What's your sign say?" So I told her, and tears just came to her eyes very quickly, and I began to explain the difference love has made in my life. And as I did, those tears turned to sobbing, and so I went in for the kill. And as I was holding her, I had her wrapped up, her shoulders just bobbing up and down with grief and emotion. And I just kept whispering in her ear, "Ma'am, God is love. God is love. And this is what love feels like." She finally regained her composure. She said this. She said, "Nobody's hugged me in a long time. And when nobody hugs you, you begin to feel like a nobody. But nobody's a nobody. Everybody's a somebody to God." And so she sat down on my cooler, and for like the next 2 hours, she just had this crazy grin on her face as she watched me hug one person after another. I've probably hugged 10, 15,000 people. And 17, you'll get to meet someday, and she's one of them. Surrendered her life in the waters of baptism. Ernest Hemingway once wrote a short story that was so short. It only had 6 words in it. And some have said it was his greatest work because it was his most personal work. He wrote years ago, "For sale, baby shoes, never worn. Many of you have experienced the pain of burying a loved one. I did the wedding of a friend of mine and then turned around 19 days later and spoke at his wife's funeral. Married and buried in 19 days. And we're sitting in the waiting room and the doctor leaves, having just told my buddy that his wife had died suddenly, unexpectedly, inexplicably. And you've been there, there's just no words. There's no strength. And then he looked at me and sitting there and he just said it. Not quite what I was planning. You know this. There's 6 seals in Revelation 6. And you just get the impression that everyone's waiting for the 7th seal to break open. That everyone's waiting for the 7th word to undo the first 6 words. And the 7th word comes in Revelation chapter 7. And it's more than just a word. It's the word. And the word has a name, and you know his name. It's a name that changes everything and everyone. It's the name Jesus. And Jesus is more than just the 7th word. He's the 7th day. When we lack the strength to stand up, he's our day of rest.